I'd rather not say my name, but I'm a 37-year-old woman from Surrey, England. You see, I've developed xylophobia, a fear of forests and woodlands. It's not just a simple aversion. It's an irrational dread that grips me, suffocates me even at the thought of venturing into those dense, shadowed realms. Let me clarify what xylophobia truly entails. It's not, as a friend amusingly suggested once, a fear of xylophones, which I actually quite like. No, it's a fear deeply rooted in the woods, in the trees, in the unknown that lurks within. It all started with a traumatic event, a story I feel compelled to share, not only for my own catharsis, but also in the hope that it might resonate with someone out there, someone who needs to know they're not alone, someone who needs to understand that there's life beyond the darkness. I've been undergoing therapy, the kind that delves deep into the psyche, peeling back layers of fear and trauma. Cognitive behavioral therapy, they call it, a fancy term for confronting your demons head-on. And so, I embarked on a journey of writing, of pouring out the horrors that haunt me onto the page, hoping that by facing them, I might regain some semblance of control. But let me take you back to where it all began, back to Avenger Common, a quaint village where I once called home. It was a place where the woods beckoned, promising solace amidst the chaos of daily life. And so, I took to running, carving out a path through the trees, finding solace in the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the earth. Those runs became my lifeline, my escape from the pressures of work and the suffocating grip of anxiety. I ran the same trails, at the same times, like a ritual that kept the darkness at bay. But one fateful day, the ritual was shattered, torn apart by a chance encounter with a stranger on the trail. He appeared innocuous at first, just another hiker wandering through the woods. But as he drew closer, his intentions became chillingly clear. With a sudden violent lunge, he sent me crashing to the ground, the breath knocked from my lungs. I felt the sting of his fist against my skin, the searing pain as my head connected with the unforgiving bark of a tree. I fought, desperately, fiercely, but he was relentless, his grip tightening around my throat, dragging me further into the depths of the forest. I screamed, I pleaded, but my words were lost in the silent embrace of the trees. In those moments of terror, I made a choice to survive at any cost. I played dead, feigning weakness in the hopes of catching him off guard, and to my disbelief, it worked. He hesitated, his resolve shaken by the possibility of his actions having fatal consequences. And so, with every ounce of strength left in me, I fled, racing through the forest, the echoes of his footsteps fading into the distance. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs threatened to give out beneath me. But even as I escaped, the fear remained, festering within me like a poison. For he was never caught, never brought to justice for the horrors he inflicted upon me. And so, the woods became a prison, a place of nightmares and endless dread. I've since moved away from Avenger Common, but the fear still lingers, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. And yet, I refuse to let it consume me entirely. I cling to the hope that one day, I'll reclaim the woods as my own, that I'll find peace amidst the trees once more. And so, I share my story, not as a tale of despair, but as a testament to resilience, to the unyielding strength of the human spirit. For even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, always a flicker of light amidst the shadows. And it's that glimmer of hope that keeps me going, that reminds me that I am not alone, that I am capable of overcoming even the greatest of fears. There's something thrilling about setting off on a solo trip, especially to places where not many would dare to tread. My love for solo travel has taken me to some pretty wild places, but none as mysterious as the cypress swamp in Arkansas. It was just across the mighty Mississippi River, a place where the air felt ancient, and secrets seemed to whisper with the wind. I've had my share of adventures, like the time I stared down a bear in Colorado, but this was different. This was the swamp, a place out of a storybook, and I was determined to camp there, under its starless sky. The drive was long and filled with anticipation. The closer I got, the more the modern world seemed to fall away, replaced by dense forests and the heavy, humid air of the swamp. By the time I reached the end of the dirt road, the sun was just a memory, and the swamp's silhouette loomed ominously. I hurried to set up my campsite. The tent went up first, followed by a small, crackling fire to boil water for dinner. Beef stroganoff, again. My buddies Brandon and Raleigh thought it'd be funny to gift me a mountain of it before I left. Despite the repetition, it tasted good, a warm, comforting presence in the growing dark. As night fully embraced the swamp, the usual sounds of wildlife filled the air. Frogs croaked, crickets sang, and somewhere, an otter splashed. It was a live orchestra, one that I had learned to appreciate over my travels. Yet, amidst this natural symphony, a peculiar sound caught my attention. A knock. Or was it a ping? It was hard to tell, but it definitely didn't belong. Curiosity piqued. I listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source. Then another knock, from a completely different direction. My heart raced a little. This was no ordinary night in the swamp. The knocks continued, a mysterious call and response between unseen beings. It felt like the swamp was communicating, and I was an uninvited guest trying to decipher a foreign language. With my flashlight in hand, I ventured closer to the water's edge, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of this ecosystem. The light caught the reflective eyes of various swamp creatures, an eerie yet fascinating sight. I felt a blend of fear and exhilaration. Here I was, alone in the heart of a swamp, surrounded by sounds that shouldn't exist. It was thrilling, yet a small voice in the back of my mind whispered caution. I couldn't shake off the tales of the swamp I'd heard as a kid. Stories of ghostly apparitions, mythical creatures, and unsolved mysteries. Was I standing in the middle of one such story? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Yet the adventurer in me relished this moment. It was why I traveled solo after all, to face the unknown, to listen to the wild stories nature had to tell. The night deepened, and the knocks grew more frequent. My curiosity battled with a growing sense of unease. What was out there in the dark waters? Were the stories true, or was this just the swamp playing tricks on my mind? I knew the risks of solo camping, the importance of being prepared for anything. Yet, nothing could have prepared me for this. A night when the swamp itself seemed alive, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. As I crawled into my tent, the sounds continued, a mysterious serenade that promised no sleep. I lay there listening, wondering, daring to imagine what lay beyond the veil of darkness. This was the adventure I craved, the unknown I sought. Here, in the heart of the swamp, I found it. Lying in my tent, the fabric walls felt like the only thin barrier between me and the vast unknown world of the swamp. The knocks and mumblings continued, each sound sending a ripple of unease through me. My mind raced with every horror story I'd ever heard about swamps. Ghostly figures, creatures lurking beneath the water, and even tales of people getting lost, never to be found again. But there I was, in the middle of it all, my heart pounding not just with fear, but with a strange kind of excitement too. I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe the sounds were just animals communicating in their natural habitat, or perhaps the wind playing tricks as it passed through the trees. But the knocks seemed too deliberate, too intentional. And the mumbling, it was like whispers, voices trying to tell me something, or maybe warning me. As the night wore on, the sounds seemed to circle around me, coming from every direction. It felt like I was being watched, observed by unseen eyes. The thought made my skin crawl. I remembered stories of swamp creatures from my childhood, of mysterious beings that roamed these waters. My imagination ran wild, painting vivid pictures of what lurked just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I couldn't stay there. The feeling of being surrounded, the eerie sounds, the unnerving whispers, they all became too much. It was one thing to seek adventure, but another to ignore the primal instinct of fear that screamed at me to leave. Making up my mind, I decided to break camp. My hands shook as I hastily packed up, every rustle in the dark making me jump. The swamp felt alive, aware of my intentions to flee. Leaving the campsite behind, I made my way to my truck, the sounds following me until I was well away from the water's edge. Driving away, I glanced back at the murky shadows, half expecting to see something emerge. But there was nothing, just the dense, impenetrable darkness of the swamp. Finding a new place to camp further up the road, I settled in for what I hoped would be a more peaceful night. Yet, sleep eluded me. The events of the evening replayed in my mind, each sound and whisper magnifying in the silence of the night. I questioned what I had heard, what I had felt. Was it all just a product of my imagination? Or had there really been something out there, in the depths of the swamp? Despite the fear, there was a part of me that felt alive, exhilarated by the unknown. It was a reminder of why I chose to travel alone, to face the wilderness head-on. There's something about the unpredictability, the mystery of the natural world that calls to me. It's not just about the landscapes or the solitude. It's about confronting the unknown, about finding strength in oneself when faced with fear. As dawn broke, the night's events seemed like a distant dream, yet the feeling of unease lingered. The swamp had challenged me, tested my resolve. I knew I would carry this experience with me, a reminder of the thin line between adventure and recklessness. But for all its mystery and menace, the swamp had also offered me something invaluable, a moment of true confrontation with the wild, a test of my courage against the primal forces of nature. And so, as I packed up once again, ready to continue my journey, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. The swamp, with all its shadows and sounds, had given me a story of my own to tell, a testament to the power of the wild and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. Moving into Grandma's old house in Ottawa Lake, Michigan, wasn't exactly my dream scenario. But after she passed away in 2015, my parents thought it would be good for me, a fresh start or something. The house was a decent-sized ranch, sitting quietly on an acre of land, surrounded by woods that stretched over 40 acres or more. Those woods, they say, had secrets, dark ones, including a story about a local murder back in the 70s. Creepy, right? The area around had changed a lot, lots of new houses and stuff, but those woods? Untouched. Now there was talk about clearing them for more houses, and somehow, that made me want to share what happened a few years back, before those woods and their secrets are gone for good. The house had 3 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. I ended up in Grandma's old room, on the east side facing the woods. Weirdly, this part of the house was super close to those woods. Never figured out why. So it was this one summer evening, around 6:45 p.m., sun just starting to set, and I had just pulled into the driveway. The moment I shut the garage door and stepped into the house, something felt off. It was too quiet. Usually you could hear the well pump or the boiler, but nothing. And the air, it felt thick, almost suffocating. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it's just one of those quiet nights. But then, when I tried to watch TV, the volume was so low, I had to crank it up to 100 and could still barely hear it. Weird, considering it was just an old antenna TV, but still, it was like the silence was swallowing up the sound. Dinner was uneventful, just me trying to shake off the eerie calm. But as I moved through the house, that feeling of unease grew. It was like the house was holding its breath. I decided to take a bath, hoping it would relax me. But even the faucet sounded muffled, like it was far away. That's when I really started to freak out. Something was definitely not right. The silence was too heavy, too deliberate. Pulling myself together, I walked into my bedroom to grab my clothes from the closet. One of the windows faced the woods, and for some reason, I felt compelled to look out. Big mistake. There, just beyond the tree line, was something I couldn't explain. A creature, about 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and fur that shimmered gold and silver in the fading light. Its eyes glowed golden, and its head, it was like a Doberman's but bigger, more menacing, and it was staring right at me. I froze, heart pounding. It didn't move, just kept looking at me with those eerie eyes. Then, as if someone pressed play on the world again, it turned and disappeared into the woods, and suddenly, all the normal sounds rushed back. I could hear the tub, the distant sound of a car, the normal noises of life. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak and whisper of the house made me jump. What was that thing? Why was it so quiet when it was there? And most importantly, would it come back? The next day, I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, especially near the windows facing those woods. I knew I had to do something, anything to feel safe again. But what could I do against something like that? Something so unknown. After seeing that thing in the woods, my sense of security was shattered. Every shadow seemed menacing. Every night sound felt like a warning. I couldn't shake off the image of its golden eyes, watching me. I knew I had to do something, anything, to feel safe in my own home again. So I went all out. I installed floodlight cameras around the house, making sure every corner was covered. I got an alarm system, the kind that would wake up the entire neighborhood if triggered. And yeah, I even bought a shotgun. Maybe it was overkill, but seeing something that seemed ripped from a horror movie will do that to you. For a while, things went back to normal, or as normal as they could get. I tried to convince myself that what I saw was just a trick of the light, or maybe a particularly vivid nightmare. But deep down, I knew it was real. Then, almost a year to the day after my first encounter, it happened again. It was after a night hanging out with my buddies in the basement, playing pool, and trying to forget about the creature. Everyone had left, and I was just shutting off the lights when I decided to call it a night. I had just dozed off when I woke up suddenly. It was around 3 a.m., and something had pulled me from sleep, though I didn't know what. Then I heard it, a scratching sound, coming from the window where the air conditioner was fitted. My first thought was, it's back. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the shotgun from under my bed and hit the panic button on the alarm system. The alarm was deafening, slicing through the quiet night. The scratching stopped immediately. I stayed in my room, shotgun aimed at the door, heart racing until the sheriff arrived. It took him about 35 minutes to get to my place, given how far out we lived. When he did, I explained what happened, my voice shaking. We checked the security footage together. The camera by the air conditioner had caught something, a big, tall silhouette moving away from the window. The sheriff suggested it might be a bear, but we both knew that didn't make sense. There are no bears here. He left after a thorough search, and I was alone again, with nothing but my thoughts and fears for company. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I examined the outside of the house, looking for any signs of the creature. Nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace but the gouges in the trees near the wood's edge, like something massive had clawed at them. I spent the next few days jumpy, constantly checking the cameras, half expecting, half dreading to see that creature again. But there was nothing, just the occasional raccoon or stray cat. Despite the lack of evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of not being alone. The woods that I once found peaceful now seemed to harbor unknown dangers. I found myself avoiding the windows at night, the memory of those golden eyes etched into my mind. I didn't know what it wanted, or if it would come back. All I knew was that I couldn't let my guard down, not again. The creature had made two things abundantly clear. It was real, and it was close. Too close for comfort. Ever since the night the creature came back, my house felt more like a fortress than a home. The floodlight cameras, the alarm system, the shotgun by my bed, they were all constant reminders that safety was just an illusion. That thing in the woods had shattered my peace, and now, every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. I lived on the edge of a nightmare, never knowing if or when it would decide to step into reality again. I spent a lot of time thinking about the creature. What was it? Why did it come so close to my house? And why did it leave without harming anything? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. None of it made any sense. And the silence from the woods, the lack of any new sightings, only made the mystery deeper, more unsettling. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life had to go on, and so I tried my best to get back to normal. I went to school, hung out with my friends, and did my homework. But the creature was always there, in the back of my mind, a dark shadow lurking in the unseen corners of my thoughts. Occasionally, I would hear sounds at night, strange, unidentifiable noises that seemed too deliberate to be the work of the usual nocturnal animals. Each time, my heart would stop, and I'd hold my breath, listening, waiting for something to happen. But nothing ever did. It was as if the creature was playing a game, reminding me of its presence without ever showing itself. I checked the cameras every day, scanning through the footage for any sign of it, but there was never anything conclusive. Just the occasional deer or fox, their eyes glowing in the night vision like ghosts passing through my yard. Living with the unknown became my new normal. I learned to carry my fear with me, a constant weight that I got used to bearing. And though I never saw the creature again, its impact on my life was indelible. It had changed the way I saw the world, taught me that there are mysteries out there, hidden in the dark, that we're not meant to understand. The woods that had once seemed so inviting now felt like a boundary, a line I wasn't brave enough to cross. I couldn't bring myself to explore them as I had before, too afraid of what I might find, or what might find me. The mystery of the creature, its origins, its intentions, all of it remained unsolved. A chapter of my life left open, unresolved. As time passed, I found myself wondering less and less about the creature. Maybe it had moved on. Or maybe it had never been real in the first place. A figment of my imagination, fueled by fear and the eerie silence of the woods. But deep down, I knew it was real. I had seen it, and it had seen me. I learned to live with the fear, with the knowledge that some things are beyond our understanding. The creature in the woods became a part of my story, a reminder that the world is bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than we can ever imagine. And somehow accepting that felt like a victory, a way to reclaim my peace, one uncertain day at a time. The day I decided to venture into Lee Woods was born out of a simple desire for something more. The streets of Bristol, once teeming with endless possibilities, had shrunk to a mundane loop of concrete and predictable turns. I was 17, filled with that restless energy that demanded new challenges, new sights. So when the idea of exploring Lee Woods sprang to mind, it wasn't just an idea, it felt like a calling. I remember sitting at my desk, the glow of the computer screen casting long shadows across the room. My fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up information about Lee Woods. It was close, just a couple of miles from home, yet it was a place I had never given much thought. The articles and forums painted it as a peaceful retreat, a slice of nature's untouched beauty amidst our urban sprawl. I imagined the dense foliage, the whisper of the trees, and the trails that snaked through the heart of the woods, like arteries of adventure. It was decided then. I would ride my mountain bike into Lee Woods, seeking the thrill of the unknown. The morning of my expedition arrived with a soft, golden light that filtered through my bedroom window. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting. I dressed quickly, filled a backpack with essentials, and wheeled my bike out of the garage. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of early spring and the promise of warmth. The ride to Lee Woods was a meditative experience. Pedaling through the quiet streets, I watched as the urban landscape gradually gave way to the green embrace of the countryside. My heart beat in sync with the rhythmic turn of the wheels, a cadence of anticipation building with every mile. Standing at the entrance to Lee Woods, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of tranquility. The forest canopy stretched skyward, a tapestry of green that seemed to pull me in. I took a deep breath, the scent of earth and ancient wood filling my lungs, and felt a profound connection to the world around me. It was almost dreamlike, the way the beauty of the place settled over me, a stark contrast to the concrete and noise I had left behind. I approached the trailhead, noting the colored markers that designated different paths. Blue, red, green, each a silent invitation to discover what lay beyond. My gaze lingered on the blue trail, the symbol of an easy path, but the very essence of adventure is the pursuit of challenge. With a determined nod, I steered my bike toward the trail marked with the more daunting red sign. The trail welcomed me with a canopy of leaves that danced in the gentle breeze, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. As I pedaled deeper into the woods, the noise of the city faded into a distant memory, replaced by the symphony of nature. Birds called to one another, a background melody to the soft crunch of my tires on the path. Yet, as I ventured further, a subtle shift occurred. The comforting embrace of the woods seemed to tighten, the shadows lengthening and deepening into something more ominous. It was as if the forest itself was watching, its ancient inhabitants whispering secrets I could not understand. The thrill of adventure mingled with a creeping unease, a prelude to the strange and terrifying events that were to unfold. I was unaware then, pedaling eagerly into the heart of Lee Woods, that this ride would not just be a test of my courage, but a confrontation with the inexplicable. As the trail wound deeper into the forest, I was about to discover that some places hold mysteries that are better left unexplored. The deeper I rode into Lee Woods, the more I felt like an intruder in a realm where ancient laws governed unseen forces. The playful curiosity that had fueled my journey began to wane, replaced by a primal alertness. I had always prided myself on my keen sense of direction, my ability to read the subtle language of the wilderness. But here, amidst the dense underbrush and towering oaks, my confidence began to falter. The trail had become a narrow ribbon, winding through the thick forest, challenging both my skill and my bike's endurance. The canopy above was so dense that it seemed to swallow the sky, casting everything in a perpetual dusk. It was in this dim light that the first prickles of unease crawled up my spine. The woods were too silent, as if holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to dismiss the sensation, attributing it to the adrenaline and the isolation. Yet the further I ventured, the stronger the feeling grew, a tangible pressure against my skin. It was then that I stumbled upon a clearing, a crossroads in the heart of the woods, that offered two paths, one that promised the safety of the familiar, leading back towards the trailhead, and another that delved deeper into the unknown. Driven by a compulsion I didn't fully understand, I chose the path that led deeper into the forest. It was as if the woods themselves were guiding my decision, whispering promises of secrets yet to be unveiled. The trail here was rough, untraveled, and it wasn't long before the terrain became too treacherous for my bike. With a resigned sigh, I dismounted, deciding to continue on foot. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees towering like silent sentinels. Every rustle in the underbrush felt like a warning, every snap of a twig a threat. I was about to turn back when I found myself in another clearing, smaller this time, with a path that seemed to beckon me forward with an almost magnetic pull. Despite the voice in my head urging caution, my feet moved of their own accord, drawn by the lure of the unknown. It was here, in this secluded part of the woods, that time seemed to slip away from me. One moment I was stepping into the clearing, and the next, I was standing still, staring down a path that had suddenly become unfamiliar, the light shifting in a way that seemed impossible. A wave of vertigo washed over me, and for a terrifying moment the forest seemed to grow and expand, the trees stretching away into the distance. Shaking off the disorientation, I realized I was lost. The path I had been following had vanished, replaced by thick underbrush and dense foliage. Panic set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. The once familiar landmarks swallowed by the forest's insatiable appetite. It was in this moment of desperation that I heard it. A soft, sobbing cry that seemed to emanate from just ahead. My heart raced as I moved towards the sound, driven by a mix of concern and an unshakable fear. As I approached, the crying grew louder, more distinct, until I was sure I was upon its source. But when I parted the branches, expecting to find someone in distress, there was nothing. No sign of life, no indication that anyone had ever been there. The silence that followed was suffocating. The woods felt alive, watching me with unseen eyes, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was not alone. The forest had always been a place of solace for me, a refuge from the cacophony of everyday life. But as I stood in the unnerving silence that followed the unexplained sobbing, Lee Woods transformed before my eyes. It became a labyrinth of fear and shadows, a place where the line between the natural and the supernatural blurred into obscurity. The decision to flee was instinctual, a primal urge to escape the unseen menace that lurked within the heart of the woods. With each step, the underbrush seemed to grasp at my feet, as if the forest itself was reluctant to release its hold on me. The trees, once majestic in their beauty, now loomed ominously, their branches clawing at the sky. As I ran, the sound of my own ragged breathing was a harsh accompaniment to the pounding of my heart. The fear that had taken root in the pit of my stomach spread through my veins like ice, propelling me forward. The sobbing had ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. I reached for my bike, my thoughts a chaotic whirl of desperation and fear. The moment my hand touched the handlebars, a sudden hiss of air stopped me cold. My back tire, previously solid and dependable, was now completely flat, sabotaging my hope for a swift escape. A surge of panic flooded through me, but surrender was not an option. I hoisted the bike onto my shoulder and began to run, the weight of it a constant reminder of my vulnerability. The path, once familiar, now seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied memory. Each step forward was a battle against the disorienting terror that the forest now embodied. The rustling of the bushes grew more frantic, as if something, or someone, was keeping pace with me, just out of sight. The thought propelled me faster, pushing my body to its limits as the edge of the forest seemed to recede with every desperate stride. It was then that the sobbing returned, a mournful wail that echoed through the trees, chilling me to my core. It was no longer just a sound, it felt like a presence, a specter of grief and despair that clung to my skin, urging me to glance back into the shadows I was so desperately trying to escape. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fear of what might be lurking just beyond my field of vision spurred me onward, driving me towards the faint promise of light that signaled the end of the forest. With every step, the sobbing grew distant, a dissonant chorus that faded into the depths of the woods, leaving behind a heavy silence. Emerging from the tree line, the sudden brightness of the open space was blinding. The car park, a symbol of the mundane world I had left behind, had never seemed so welcoming. As I stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath, the pressure in my chest began to ease. The air felt lighter here, untouched by the darkness that infested the heart of Lee Woods. Glancing down at my bike, a wave of disbelief washed over me. The tire, once deflated and useless, now appeared fully intact, as if the forest had relinquished its grip on me and my possessions. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a stark reminder of the inexplicable forces at play within those woods. I mounted my bike, the need to put as much distance between myself and Lee Woods driving me forward. As I pedaled away, the weight of what I had experienced hung heavy on my shoulders. The forest had shown me a side of nature I had never known, a realm where the boundary between reality and myth was as thin as the mist that clung to the trees. Lee Woods had left its mark on me, a scar etched into my memory. As the distance grew, The events of the day began to feel like a nightmare, a terrifying journey through a landscape that was both hauntingly beautiful and unspeakably sinister. Yet the fear remained, a constant reminder of the day I raced against shadows and the unseen watchers of the woods. The chill of the early evening air did nothing to dampen the serenity of the Aboro Nature Reserve. It was a place I'd come to call my sanctuary, a vast expanse of wilderness that seemed untouched by the chaos of the world outside its boundaries. My routine, almost sacred by now, was simple. Drive up to the deer park at dusk, park my truck at the base of the hill overlooking the sanctuary, and let the natural world wash over me. It was a routine born out of necessity during the pandemic, a way to escape the confines of my home in a town too small to hide any secrets. Or so I thought. I've lived here all my life, long enough to know every whispered legend and every odd tradition that knits this community together. But nothing, no tale whispered under the breath of elders, or warning scrawled on the old town hall's bulletin board, could explain the sign that appeared last week at the park's entrance. It wasn't the usual Forest Service notice, printed on metal and bolted to a post. No, this was something different, something hurried. A sheet of plywood, painted in hasty strokes, with words that caught the dying light in a way that made the pit of my stomach tighten. A polite notice to our valued visitors entering the Aboro Nature Reserve, it began, its tone almost apologetic. Our deer are exhibiting unusual behaviors. The list that followed was anything but ordinary park guidelines. Don't stop your car during grazing periods or on midsummer nights. Act calmly if the deer approach. Ignore any deer standing on their hind legs. A black stag with dominion over the western herd was not to be approached, under any circumstances. The words blurred together as I read, each guideline more bizarre than the last. Deer remember faces. Don't pay attention to rumors of deer congregating at night. The absurdity would have been laughable, if not for the undercurrent of urgency in every hastily painted letter. I considered turning back, letting the sanctuary remain just that in my mind. But curiosity, that old, relentless drive, pushed me forward. I'd seen the stag they mentioned, Jojo, a magnificent beast that seemed to command the western fields with an almost regal authority. I'd watched him from afar, respected his space, and marveled at the way he kept his herd in line. The thought that something could unsettle him, unsettle them, was enough to quicken my pulse. So I drove on, the tires of my truck crunching over the gravel path that wound its way through the reserve. The setting sun cast long shadows that danced across the dashboard, and for a moment, I let myself believe that this was just another evening, that the sign was a prank, a story soon to be told with laughter over beers at the local bar. But as the sanctuary enveloped me, the familiar fields and forests bathed in the twilight's last embers, a sense of unease crept in. The deer, usually a common sight, were nowhere to be seen. The air felt still, too still, as if the very land was holding its breath. And somewhere beyond the next bend, the unknown awaited, its secrets veiled by the gathering darkness, and a sign that warned of things beyond understanding. It was in this moment, between the comfort of the known and the terror of the unknown, that I felt it most acutely. The thin veil between the natural world and something far more ancient, something that whispered of old, forgotten pacts and rituals born from the very earth itself. And as I parked my truck and stepped into the fading light, I knew that whatever lay ahead, whatever truth the park concealed, my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. The night had draped itself over the Aboro Nature Reserve like a shroud, the moon a mere sliver in the sky, casting long, sinister shadows across the landscape. The air was thick with mist, wrapping around the trees and the fields in a ghostly embrace. It was on nights like these that the world seemed to shift, revealing a face less familiar, more primal. I had driven back to the deer park, drawn by a need to understand. to see for myself what lay behind the bizarre warnings that had unsettled my once peaceful retreat. The park was different under the cloak of darkness. The familiar paths and clearings were transformed, hiding secrets that felt ancient, almost sacred. As I parked my truck at the usual spot, the silence was oppressive, a heavy blanket that muffled the sound of my own breathing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something, that my presence was a violation of an unwritten pact between the land and its true inhabitants. It was then that I saw them, the deer. But these were not the creatures I had come to know. They moved with an unsettling grace, standing on their hind legs in a grotesque parody of humanity. Their eyes, usually so gentle, now gleamed with an otherworldly light. The sight was surreal, a nightmare brought to life in the heart of the sanctuary I had once found solace in. At the center of this twisted gathering was Jojo, the majestic stag I had admired from afar, but the creature that now stood before me was a shadow of his former self, surrounded by the not deer, as if he were the focal point of some dark ritual. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I struggled to comprehend what I was witnessing. The not deer moved with purpose, dragging something with them, a structure, primitive yet unmistakably an altar of some sort. Jojo was led to it, his once proud stance now defeated, resigned to his fate. The ritual that unfolded was one of savagery and primal worship, a celebration of darkness that belonged to an age long forgotten. As the not deer shrieked their unholy cries to the moon, a response came from the depths of the forest, a groan that spoke of ancient hunger and untold power. The very ground beneath me trembled, and I knew in that moment that I was witnessing something not meant for human eyes. The ritual reached its climax with Jojo's sacrifice, a display of violence and reverence that left me numb with shock and horror. I should have fled then, should have turned my back on the nightmare unfolding before me, but a morbid fascination held me captive, a need to understand the unfathomable. And as the not deer turned their gaze upon me, their eyes void of emotion yet filled with an intelligence that spoke of deep ancient knowledge, I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no return. The drive back to civilization was a blur of terror and confusion. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, a cryptic warning that now held a sinister weight. As long as they didn't look at you, you're fine, he had said. But they had looked at me, had seen me witness their most sacred and profane ritual. And in that moment of shared gaze, a connection was forged, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that lay hidden in the heart of the Aboro Nature Reserve, that we are not alone, and that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than we could ever imagine. Ever since that night at the Aboro Nature Reserve, the world around me has felt altered, like I've been living in the shadow of something vast and unknowable. The once comforting solitude of my home in the outskirts of town has become oppressive, each creak and whisper of the wind a reminder of the eyes that might be watching, of the ancient rites performed under the cover of darkness. I tried to convince myself it was all a dream, a figment of my overactive imagination fueled by the isolation of the pandemic. But the deeper part of me knew better. The forest ranger's words kept replaying in my mind, a cryptic clue to a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. So long as they didn't look at you, you're fine. But they had looked at me, their gaze piercing through the veil of my skepticism, leaving me marked. The days following were a blur of sleepless nights and restless days. My routine, once a source of comfort, now felt like a perilous journey through a landscape that had turned hostile. The deer park, my sanctuary, had become a place of dread, its secrets too dark, too ancient for me to comprehend. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go back, to confront whatever it was that lurked in the shadows of the reserve. Perhaps it was the need for closure, or maybe a foolhardy attempt to reclaim my sense of safety. Whatever the reason, I found myself driving back to the park, the setting sun casting long shadows that seemed to reach out towards me. The park was eerily quiet, the usual chorus of wildlife silenced, as if in anticipation of something. The mist that had shrouded the reserve on that fateful night was gone, replaced by a clear sky that offered no solace from the prying eyes of the unseen. I parked my truck at the usual spot, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. As I scanned the horizon with my binoculars, the events of that night played back in my mind. The not deer, Jojo's sacrifice, the ancient being that had responded to their calls. It was a scene out of a nightmare, yet here I was, searching for proof that it hadn't been a dream. The realization hit me then, a cold wave of understanding that chilled me to the bone. Whatever had happened that night, it was part of something much larger, a cycle of nature that was as old as the land itself. I was an intruder in a world that operated on laws and rituals beyond human comprehension. A movement in the periphery of my vision caught my attention, a reminder that I was not alone. I turned, half expecting to see the not deer staring back at me. Instead, I found myself looking into the eyes of the forest ranger. His expression was one of resigned understanding, as if he knew the burden I now carried. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find the words to describe the terror and awe that had consumed me. "It's best to leave them be," he continued, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "Some things are better left untouched, unseen. The world is full of mysteries, and not all of them are meant to be solved." His words were a cold comfort, a reminder of the fragile boundary between the known and the unknown. As I drove away from the park that evening, I knew that my life had been irrevocably changed. The deer park would forever be a symbol of that change, a place where the veil between worlds was thin and where the ancient guardians of the land held sway. The drive home was a silent reflection on the nature of fear and curiosity, on the human desire to understand the mysteries of the world. But some mysteries, I realized, are better left unsolved, their secrets preserved in the shadows, watched over by those who know the true cost of looking too closely. My name's Maddie, and I guess you could say I'm your average Seattle mom, if there's even such a thing as average around here. Between keeping up with my 2 kiddos and working full-time, life is a whirlwind of soccer practices, meal preps, and the occasional coffee run that turns into my mini escape from reality. I don't get much me time, but when I do, I dive into YouTube, losing myself in stories that are anything but ordinary. There's this one channel, all about mysterious disappearances, that I've been hooked on lately. It's not exactly light viewing, but hey, we all have our things, right? I've lived in Seattle all my life, but it's funny how you can forget things like how green the trees are in spring, or the way the city lights shimmer off Puget Sound at night. But there's one thing I thought I'd forgotten for good, a memory buried so deep that I never thought I'd see it again, until last night. I was halfway through a video about missing 411 cases, those strange stories of people vanishing without a trace. Normally, I'm not easily spooked. Seattle folks are made of tough stuff. But one story hit me like a freight train. It wasn't the creepiest or most bizarre tale, but it unlocked something in my mind, a door I thought I'd locked tight many years ago. Back in high school, I was what you might call an accidental athlete. I stumbled into cross-country running, or XC as we called it, and discovered I had a knack for it. I wasn't the fastest at sprints, and don't even get me started on team sports. A disaster waiting to happen, but give me a long stretch of trail, and I could run for days. It was my thing, my escape, and before I knew it, I was dreaming of snagging an athletic scholarship. High school. Maddie was a bit of an oddball, not quite fitting in with the jocks or the nerds, but floating somewhere in between. Running gave me a sense of belonging, and I clung to it like a lifeline. My parents, ever practical, saw it as a potential ticket to college. So, with their cautious encouragement, I dedicated myself to the sport, training relentlessly in hopes of catching the eye of university scouts. It wasn't easy. Balancing schoolwork with training sessions left me perpetually exhausted and cranky. Imagine trying to solve algebra equations after running 10 miles in the rain. Not a pretty picture. But I had my sights set on a scholarship, and nothing was going to stand in my way. Kaya, one of my teammates, was in a similar boat. We were both chasing that elusive scholarship dream, though I think she was more about the academics than the running. We weren't exactly best friends, but we understood each other in a way that only teammates can. We shared the same goals, the same fears, and as it turned out, the same race that would change everything. As I listened to that missing 411 video, memories of Kaya and that fateful day flooded back. It was like watching a movie of my own life, scenes playing out with a clarity that took my breath away. I remembered the anticipation, the adrenaline, and then the confusion and terror of what happened next. It was a day that would tie us together forever, a reminder of how quickly things can change, how suddenly the familiar can become unfamiliar. And just like that, a piece of my past I thought was lost came rushing back, as vivid and startling as if it had happened yesterday. It was early May, and everything was in full bloom. You could smell the fresh, earthy scent of spring in the air, mixed with a hint of excitement and nervous energy. That day was important for Kaya and me. It wasn't just any race. It was our chance to shine, to prove that all our hard work and sacrifices were worth it. A scholarship was on the line, and we both knew it. We strategized like it was a military operation. Skip the first water station to get ahead, power through to the second, and then push ourselves to the limit before the final stretch. It sounded simple in theory, but executing it was going to take everything we had. The Awai Lakes Trail was beautiful, a runner's dream, with its winding paths around the lake and the towering presence of Mount Rainier in the distance. But that day, the beauty of the trail was the last thing on my mind. My focus was on the race, on keeping my pace steady and my breathing even. Kaya and I started strong, bypassing the first water station with a determined glance at each other. We were in sync, each step propelling us forward, closer to our goal. But as we approached the third station, something shifted. I could feel it in the air, a sudden change that sent a shiver down my spine. Kaya stopped abruptly, her movements erratic and unlike her. I watched, bewildered, as she began to undress, her focus entirely removed from the race and me. It was as if she was in a world of her own, unreachable and distant. I called out to her, confusion turning to concern, but she didn't respond. She just kept stripping down, oblivious to my pleas and the race around us. Panic set in. This wasn't the Kaya I knew. This was someone else, someone driven by an unseen force. I tried to reach her, to break through the barrier that had formed between us, but it was like talking to a ghost. Then, she started walking towards the trees, naked and vulnerable. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run for help, to leave her and fetch someone who could make sense of the situation. But another part, the part that had trained with her, laughed with her, and shared dreams of the future with her, refused to leave her side. I shouted for help, my voice echoing through the woods, desperate for someone, anyone, to come. And when the race marshal appeared, I thought we were saved. But his reaction, a mix of shock and disbelief, only added to the surreal nightmare unfolding before me. He turned and left, promising to bring help. But in that moment, I felt utterly alone. It was just me and Kaya, in a race that had suddenly lost all meaning. I grabbed her wrist, trying to anchor her to reality, to me. But she was lost, slipping further away with every step she took into the woods. I had to make a choice then. Let her go, or fight to bring her back. I chose to fight, to hold on to her even as she tried to break free. I yelled, pleaded, and finally, in a moment of sheer desperation, I used water in an attempt to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. It didn't work. She continued on her path, leaving me to grapple with the fear of what might happen if I couldn't bring her back. The race, the scholarship, our future, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was Kaya, and the terrifying possibility that I might lose her to the woods, to a mystery that neither of us understood. After the race, life sort of went back to normal, or at least as normal as it could get after something like that happens. Kaya was okay, physically. Everyone said it was just heat stroke, a fluke thing that could happen to anyone if they pushed too hard or forgot to stay hydrated. But something about that explanation didn't sit right with me. Sure, people get heat stroke, but do they all react like Kaya did? Stripping down and walking into the woods like they're being called by something only they can hear. It felt too simple, too neat of an explanation for something that felt anything but. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not just about what happened, but about what could have happened. What if I hadn't been there? What if I hadn't caught up to her? Those questions haunted me, swirling around in my head until they formed a current too strong to ignore. So, I did what any teenager with internet access and too much on their mind does. I fell down a rabbit hole of research. I started with heat stroke, reading up on symptoms and treatments, trying to convince myself that what happened to Kaya was just a medical issue. But then, one click led to another, and suddenly I was reading about missing 411 cases, about people who vanished into thin air in national parks and wilderness areas. The more I read, the more I saw patterns. Not everyone who disappeared had stripped down, but enough of them had for it to be a thing. A weird, unexplainable thing that nobody had answers for. And then, there was the video that started it all. The one about Maren Kelly. Her story was eerily similar to Kaya's, right down to the stripping and walking into the woods. Except Maren never came back. She disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that seemed to have more questions than answers. That's when it hit me. What happened to Kaya wasn't just a one-off. It was part of something bigger, something darker, something that nobody really understood. I spent nights glued to my computer screen, reading forum posts and articles, watching videos of interviews with search and rescue workers who'd seen things they couldn't explain. The deeper I went, the more I realized that we were lucky. Kaya came back. So many others didn't. The theories varied from the plausible to the outlandish. Some said it was natural phenomena, like sudden weather changes or unknown environmental toxins. Others talked about psychological states, about how stress or fear could push a person into doing things they wouldn't normally do. And then there were the more out there theories, cryptids, aliens, dimensional rifts. It was a lot to take in, and most of it sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie. But after what I'd seen, I wasn't ready to discount anything. The one thing that kept coming up in my research was the idea of a fugue state, a temporary amnesia that makes people forget who they are and what they're doing. It was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that explained how Kaya could have done what she did without remembering any of it. But what caused it? And why did it seem like the wilderness itself was a trigger? I didn't have the answers. Nobody did. But I knew one thing. What happened to Kaya wasn't just a fluke. It was a warning, a glimpse into something that none of us really understand. And as much as I wanted to forget, to move on and pretend like it was all just a bad dream, I couldn't. Because somewhere out there, in the woods and the wild places of the world, something was happening. Something that could take you away, leaving nothing behind but questions and shadows. And the scariest part? I wasn't sure we were ever meant to find the answers. As weeks turned into months, the memory of the race and Kaya's inexplicable behavior lingered like a shadow, never quite leaving my side. Life moved forward, as it always does, with the rhythm of school, running, and the everyday routine smoothing over the jagged edges of that day. But beneath the surface, questions bubbled up, stubborn and persistent. I found myself looking at the world differently. The trails I once ran with abandon now seemed to whisper secrets, hidden just beyond my understanding. The woods, with their deep shadows and rustling leaves, felt like they were watching, waiting. It was as though I had glimpsed behind a curtain I wasn't supposed to know existed, and now, I couldn't unsee it. Kaya and I didn't talk much about what happened. It was like an unspoken agreement, a mutual understanding that some things are too strange, too unsettling to put into words. She recovered, physically at least, and we both threw ourselves into our running, but the camaraderie we once shared was tinged with an undercurrent of unease. The missing 411 stories, once a morbid curiosity, now felt too close to home. I couldn't shake the feeling that Kaya and I had skirted the edge of something profound and terrifying. The theories I'd read about, from environmental toxins to psychological states, offered no real comfort. They were just guesses in the dark, attempts to explain the unexplainable. As graduation approached, the future loomed large, full of possibilities and uncertainties. I was leaving behind the trails and woods of high school, moving on to college and whatever came next. But the mystery of what happened to Kaya, and to all those who had vanished without a trace, remained unsolved. It was a reminder that, for all our progress and knowledge, there are still things in this world beyond our control, beyond our understanding. I thought about Kaya's brief journey into the unknown, how close we had come to a different ending. What if I hadn't been there? What if she had disappeared like Maren Kelly, leaving behind a void filled with questions and grief? It was a thought too painful to dwell on, yet impossible to ignore. As I packed up my room, preparing for the move to college, I came across my running shoes, worn and dusty from miles of training. They were a tangible link to that day, to the person I was before I understood how quickly everything could change. I realized then that I was taking more with me than just memories and hopes for the future. I was carrying a sense of caution, a respect for the unknown that I hadn't had before. The world is full of mysteries, of stories that defy explanation. Some might find that terrifying, but I've come to see it as a reminder of the vastness of our existence, of the infinite possibilities that lie just beyond our understanding. We may not find all the answers, but perhaps it's enough to keep asking the questions, to keep seeking, even when the path leads into the shadows. As I stepped into the next chapter of my life, I carried with me the lessons of that race, the knowledge that we are all just visitors here, navigating a world that holds more wonders and mysteries than we could ever hope to understand. And maybe, in the end, that's what makes life so endlessly fascinating. The search, the journey, and the unanswered questions that keep us looking, always looking, for what lies beyond the next bend in the trail.